Reacting is different than responding, and while this may sound logical and full of common sense, it is not so straightforward when we are talking about grief. So today we're going to explore the difference between these two concepts of reacting and responding through our grief lens. Hi, I'm Jo McRogers, and I am a social worker who supports grief through this YouTube channel and through my private therapy practice. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on the notifications so that you'll know when each time I post about all things grief, and so that YouTube will know to share this broadly so that grief can be seen and held and supported and normalized. So today, let's begin with some definitions. First, let's talk about a reaction. When we react, it is instinctive. It is often equal and opposite to a particular event. A reaction is instant, instinctive, and purely emotional. It's driven usually by our unconscious mind. That's why we often react without thinking. A reaction is based entirely in the heat of the moment. When we react, we rarely consider the long-term consequences of our actions, and a reaction may result in either positive or a negative outcome. Reacting is emotional, it is normal, it is based on fear and survival, and it results in the fight, flight, and often underlooked freeze mode. When we react, we're at the mercy of our emotions. Our reptilian brain, which is designed to keep us safe, makes a knee-jerk reaction based on the emotions of the moment. Next, let's consider a response. Responding takes into consideration the desired outcome of our actions, of our interactions. A response is a design pathway to produce a positive outcome. A response is fueled by the more evolved part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex. This part of the brain is responsible for our more complex thoughts. When we respond, we are in control of our thoughts. We use logic to consider the consequences. We make decisions based upon our current existing values. Responding is using emotional intelligence with purpose, intention, and strategy. And as such, a response usually aligns with our core values. It is founded on values, needs, and outcomes, and processing thoughts. It does not come from fear, vulnerability, and survival. So what wisdom does this reflection offer us when we are talking about living with our grief? Grief is experienced by our head, hearts, and bodies as a threat. So you can imagine that the reaction is going to be very large. Think of the moment that you learned of the death of someone who you loved, or you were there to witness it. Can you remember those initial reactions? Short, sharp intake of breath, the questioning of what, why, and how, and then the usual response of no, this can't be real. Then think of the next steps and actions that you took. Telling others with shaking and breathlessness, or telling others with flatness and numbness. Making arrangements for the body, for the funeral, for the Shiva, for the burial, the temple. Shock, adrenaline, and disbelief rule. Sleep is non-existent, or it overtakes. While feeling so low or numb, our body is actually held in the high vibration of detecting danger. Fight, flight, or freeze. None of these states or actions have been decisions. They are automatic and serve as our grounding foundations of how to do our grief. We tell ourselves that this is what grief feels like. It lasts no defined time, and it limits us in so many ways eventually. Our grief reaction turns us upside down. We lose any of our usual landmarks in life. This state is necessary at some point. It supports us in the crisis. It comes to our rescue. So thank goodness for reactions. However, at some point, our relationship to our grief needs to change. Remaining in a grief reaction state at some point starts to limit our life, our ability to love, our ability to take risks, our ability to be connected. Our reptilian brain will let us sleepwalk through life if we let it, if we stay in the reaction phase. This is the time and place where I ask people to enter into their relationship with their grief. How will you respond? How will you use your emotional intelligence? How will you identify what core values, beliefs, and actions are going to support you in your grief and in your life? But in order to design a response, grief first needs you to regulate both emotionally, physically, and mentally. So how to make this happen is so simple and yet so ridiculously difficult. Practicing sleep hygiene, breath work, drinking water, eating small bursts of nutrition, eating less junk food, moving and or walking, journaling, praying. There are so many ways to tend to your emotional regulation, your physical regulation, and that will then begin to show up in your ability to think straight, to make decisions, to problem solve, to have your word recall, to have your memory improved. Only then can you begin to sculpt and experiment and research about what holds you safely in order to design your grief response. Each of the actions that I mentioned remind your body that it is safe. It reminds your body and your head of what you do have control over. Each of these actions remind your head and your heart that you are safe. It lowers the perceived sense of threat and danger. Once you find your way to ground and regulate, and you are then able to access the parts of you that are larger than your grief. Your emotional intelligence, your values, your grief blueprint, your communication style. At some point you need to ask yourself, how am I going to do this? Creating your grief response takes you outside of or beyond your grief reaction. You are no longer limited by your initial reactions. They've served their purpose, and now you need to recognize that your grief is evolving and maturing and needs different efforts in order to integrate into your life. Adrenaline, shock, and autopilot are no longer needed. Emotional intelligence, evaluating outcomes, logic, personal values, safety, and control from a place of wisdom now need to serve us. Grief is hard work. It's greedy, obnoxious. It's all-encompassing and demanding in those early days especially. The task I'm asking of you is to make your grief your own. What has happened to you is important enough. Who you have loved and lost is important enough. I'm asking you to make that step from your initial grief reaction to stepping into a relationship with your grief by designing your grief response. It's so important that we don't stay stuck in our grief reactions. It's so important that we don't stay connected to that. That's how we do grief. Grief is more than our initial reaction. So please consider doing your work in designing your grief response by finding ways to step into your grief relationship. I would be so curious to hear if you have any thoughts on this theory of mine. If you could put in the comments below where you feel that your grief experience changed from a reaction to a response. Or can you let us know, are you still in the reaction place and wanting to move to the response place? As you step into your relationship with your grief, I send you kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart, and know that you are so worth doing this work. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again next time.